There's a myth we've all grown up with, that success is all about talent, that some people are simply born to win. But let me ask you something. If talent were everything, why do so many gifted individuals plateau while others, often less naturally, talented, go on to break records, build empires, or change the world? Here's the truth. Mindset beats talent every single time, and here's why. Think of how a muscle grows. You don't build strength by lifting what's easy. You grow by applying progressive overload, the act of stretching your limits just slightly beyond what's comfortable. The brain works the same way. The circuits responsible for focus, motivation, and emotional regulation all respond to effort. They strengthen with repeated use, but they also require failure. They require recovery, and most importantly, they require belief. When you understand this, you realize something powerful. Mindset is not motivation. It's not a slogan, it's a system. It's how you interpret your experience. When a person with a fixed mindset fails, they interpret it as a reflection of who they are. When a person with a growth mindset fails, they interpret it as data. One person is held hostage by ego. The other is building internal resilience. Mindset changes how you interact with dopamine, and dopamine is not just a feel-good chemical. It's the molecule of pursuit. The anticipation of reward, not the reward itself, drives action. This means when you learn to enjoy the process, not just the outcome, you get a deeper, more consistent release of dopamine, and with it, motivation. People with a mindset wired for growth learn to attach reward to effort, not outcomes, and this changes everything. Consider this. Talent often gives someone an early advantage. Maybe they pick things up quicker at first. But if they haven't trained their mind to struggle well, they avoid challenges that could cause them to fail. Why? Because their identity is built around being naturally good. Any setback threatens that. They avoid discomfort to protect the image. But the person with a growth mindset, they don't expect perfection. They expect adaptation. They don't see challenges as blocks, they see them as stepping stones. That small cognitive reframe fundamentally changes what the brain does under pressure. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision making, focus, and long-term planning, stays online longer in the face of adversity when your mindset is calibrated toward growth. We can see this in functional MRI studies. Individuals who view mistakes as opportunities for learning show greater activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain responsible for detecting errors and adjusting behavior. In contrast, those with fixed mindsets show increased amygdala activation, the fear response, and tend to shut down or avoid. That's not about talent, that's about interpretation. It doesn't just change outcomes. It changes your physiology. Your hormone profile, your neuromodulators, your recovery system all respond to what you believe is possible. Let me give you a real-world example. In elite performance domains, military, athletics, medicine, the differentiating factor is rarely skill alone. It's who can stay focused and effective under pressure. Researchers have found that elite performers are more likely to engage in deliberate mental rehearsal, a practice of visualizing future effort in adversity. Why? Because it trains the nervous system to stay calm under load. Talent doesn't train that, mindset does, and this isn't just for professionals. In education, students who are taught that intelligence is malleable, that it grows with effort, perform better over time, even if they start at a disadvantage. That's not magic. That's neuroplasticity plus belief plus persistence. Again, mindset. There's also a feedback loop between challenge, stress, and adaptation. When you engage in something hard, say cold exposure, intense training, or pushing through mental fatigue, your body releases epinephrine, cortisol, and norepinephrine. These are stress hormones. If you do this regularly and learn to manage it well, you train your nervous system to interpret stress differently. It becomes a signal for action, not avoidance. This is what separates people who evolve from people who burn out, the ability to stay in the game under internal tension. And remember this, neuroplasticity is gated by two things: focus and rest. When you deeply focus on something difficult, your brain is primed to change, but it consolidates that change during rest, especially during sleep. People with a growth mindset don't just grind endlessly, they learn to cycle effort and recovery. Because they're not chasing the illusion of constant talent, they're building real systems for sustainable progress. What's fascinating is how this shows up in early childhood too. When children are praised for being smart, they become risk-averse, they fear mistakes. But when they're praised for effort and strategy, they take on more challenges. They become more resilient. That's because their brain is being taught. What matters is not what you are, but what you do and how you adapt. This is foundational. Let's look at this from a competitive standpoint. In any field, whether it's entrepreneurship, sports, creative work, or science, the difference between first and second isn't often raw talent. It's who keeps showing up, who learns faster, who recovers better, who adapts when things go sideways. In those moments, talent means very little. What matters is whether your mindset is calibrated for growth under pressure. This is the principle behind adaptive self-regulation. It's the brain's ability to monitor what's happening, update internal models, and stay engaged in the pursuit of a goal even when it gets hard. That's what a growth mindset trains. You become less reactive, more strategic, and far more resilient to setbacks. And here's the uncomfortable truth for many high performers. Early talent can actually become a liability if it prevents you from learning how to fail. If everything comes easily at the beginning, you don't develop the systems, the neurological wiring to push through plateaus. But those who had to grind from the start, they've been training that system all along. They know how to pivot, how to absorb a loss, how to come back stronger. It's the difference between a static identity and a dynamic one. This mindset even influences perception of time. People focused on outcome, the talent-oriented, tend to view time in short segments. They want results now. Those with a process-oriented mindset see time as an investment. They're more likely to delay gratification, which is correlated with better long-term outcomes, not just in achievement, but in emotional regulation and even physical health. The key takeaway here isn't that talent is useless. Talent can be helpful, but it's not determinative. The deciding factor every single time is who can manage their internal state, who can stay in the game when it gets hard, and who can continue to learn when others retreat. That's mindset, and the best part, it's trainable. Mindset also determines how you interpret uncertainty, which is one of the most important psychological skills in any high-stakes pursuit. When you're faced with ambiguity, whether it's not knowing the outcome of an exam, a business risk, or a training cycle, your brain generates prediction errors. These errors signal that something in your internal model needs to be updated. A fixed mindset often interprets this as danger. The result, cognitive rigidity, avoidance, emotional overwhelm. But a growth mindset interprets uncertainty as opportunity. In that context, the same neurochemical state, elevated acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, becomes energizing instead of paralyzing. The interpretation is what matters. Mindset shifts how the brain responds to the unknown. That difference over time compounds massively. Now let's look at the role of goal setting, another critical domain where mindset outperforms talent. Talent tends to chase outcomes. Fixed mindset individuals aim to win, to be recognized, to achieve externally. Their goals are ego-linked. They're designed to reinforce a static identity. I'm gifted, I'm elite, I'm better. People with a growth mindset build systems of goals, learning goals, performance goals, stretch goals. These are not designed to prove anything. They're designed to improve capacity. The emphasis shifts from who they are to what they are building. This subtle psychological reframe influences attention, motivation, and resilience to feedback. Let's talk feedback. People with a fixed mindset avoid critical feedback because it threatens their self-concept. The data becomes a personal attack. In contrast, those with a growth mindset actively seek feedback because to them, it's a lever, a mechanism to tune their strategy, and this difference is visible on brain scans. When fixed Said individuals receive feedback that contradicts their performance. Their medial prefrontal cortex, associated with self-referential processing, shows heightened activity. They filter the feedback through the lens of identity threat. Growth-oriented individuals show activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex, the center for cognitive control and adaptation. They stay open, curious, and strategic. That's not talent, that's mental training. Over time, this divergence becomes enormous. If you avoid feedback for 10 years, you stall. If you absorb and apply it for 10 years, you accelerate even if you started with less natural ability. This is especially important when you understand that most growth occurs at the edge of your ability, in what psychologists call the zone of proximal development, where a task is just outside your current reach, but still achievable with effort. People with talent often avoid that edge because it feels like failure. But people with a mindset for growth spend more time in that space. And because neuroplasticity is gated by effort, that extra time in the zone translates to deeper wiring, stronger skills, and more durable confidence. Let's examine confidence more deeply. True confidence isn't the absence of doubt. It's the learned expectation that effort leads to improvement. That expectation doesn't come from praise or talent, it comes from evidence. When you repeatedly engage in hard things, experience adaptation, and track the change, your brain updates its belief system. Confidence becomes embodied, not a statement, a system. This is why journaling and tracking small wins are so powerful. They don't just motivate, they provide your nervous system with tangible proof of change. You build a prediction model based on actual effort and results. That's confidence grounded in reality. There's another key factor here: emotional granularity. The ability to distinguish between similar feelings, for example, anxiety vs. anticipation or pressure vs. opportunity, is a major predictor of resilience. People with a growth mindset tend to have higher emotional granularity because they reflect more often on their states. They name, interpret, and reframe their emotions. This gives them cognitive space between stimulus and response. In contrast, those who rely on raw talent tend to overpersonalize emotional responses. I feel nervous, therefore I must not be good at this. But someone with a trained mindset says, I feel nervous, that means this matters. Let's get focused. This is a skill one that can be trained through mindfulness, journaling, and emotional self-awareness. Again, it's not about what you were born with, it's about what you're willing to practice. Let's revisit stress for a moment, not as a negative force, but as an adaptive signal. There are two types of stress responses: threat and challenge. The physiology is almost identical. Heart rate goes up, cortisol rises, pupils dilate. The difference lies in perception. A threat response says, I can't handle this. A challenge response says, this is hard, but I can grow through it. In performance settings, this distinction is massive. It determines whether your working memory stays online, whether your motor skills remain fluid, and whether you can access your best thinking under pressure. People with a growth mindset lean into challenge responses more often, not because they don't feel fear, but because they've trained their brains to associate stress with growth. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood principles in the high-performance world: identity-based neuroplasticity. You can practice behaviors all you want, but if your core identity is at odds with the behavior, your brain will resist the change. People who succeed long-term tend to update their identity as they grow. They say things like, I'm becoming someone who can handle discomfort. I'm the type of person who learns from mistakes. I'm someone who shows up even when it's hard. Those aren't affirmations, they're behavior-linked beliefs. When you act in alignment with them enough times, your brain starts to automate that identity. That's real transformation. That's mindset at the biological level. Meanwhile, people who are fixated on talent anchor their identity in a static concept: I'm good at math, I'm naturally gifted, I don't need to try hard. These beliefs feel empowering until reality no longer supports them. Then the system collapses, and this collapse is often where the most powerful transformations begin, when someone hits it. Wall loses a role or watches someone with less talent surpass them through grit. It's painful, but if they're willing to reframe, that failure becomes the seed of a much more sustainable engine, one rooted in growth. You'll also notice that people with strong growth mindsets tend to form better support systems. Why? Because they don't compete with everyone around them. They learn from them, they ask for help, they collaborate, and this strengthens another powerful factor in long-term development, social learning. Mirror neuron research shows that observing others succeed, struggle, and grow activates similar neural circuits as doing the task yourself. People with a fixed mindset feel threatened by others' success. People with a growth mindset feel inspired and use that information to accelerate their own growth curve. Social comparison becomes a tool, not a trap. We can even see this in how people talk to themselves under pressure. Talent-based individuals often default to self-judgment. I should be better than this. Why am I messing up? This activates the default mode network associated with rumination and negative self-focus. In contrast, those trained in growth mindset often shift to instructional self-talk. Stay with it. Focus on the next move. Reset. This activates the task, positive network, and keeps the brain in problem-solving mode. This is not random. This is trained. Every repetition of mental framing strengthens the associated circuitry. And when you understand this, you begin to take full ownership of your path. You realize that whether you win or lose in a moment doesn't define you. What defines you is whether you adapted, whether you chose to lean in, whether you trained your system neural, hormonal, emotional to keep showing up. That's what separates sustainable growth from short-term performance. This principle also explains why some individuals, even after achieving success, experience a plateau or worse, a breakdown. They relied on talent to get ahead, but they never developed the inner architecture to sustain growth. They weren't psychologically prepared for complexity, failure at scale, or reinvention. Talent got them up the first mountain, but it's mindset that climbs the second. In contrast, individuals with a growth mindset build systems that are robust and fragile, a term used to describe things that don't just survive chaos but improve because of it. These people don't collapse under uncertainty. They reorganize, they rebuild, they integrate. This comes not from a personality trait, but from repeated exposure to voluntary challenge. Let's talk about voluntary hardship for a moment. Intentionally exposing yourself to controlled difficulty, whether it's cold exposure, endurance training, fasting, long periods of deep work, or even rejection, conditions the brain to dissociate stress from suffering. You learn that agitation doesn't mean failure. It means opportunity. The agitation signals that neuroplasticity is available. This is where growth is possible, and this is the key insight. Mindset is a metabolic training protocol for the brain. Just like muscles require time under tension to grow, your brain requires time under uncertainty. It needs to be taken to the edge of its capacity, into a zone where doubt and effort and micro-failure live, but not so far into chaos that it breaks. That calibrated space where you are challenged, supported, and adaptive is where real transformation happens. And the people who seek this kind of tension on purpose, they win in the long game. That long game mindset is also deeply connected to delayed gratification, the ability to trade short-term comfort for long-term development. In classic studies like the Stanford marshmallow experiment, the children who could wait longer for a greater reward went on to achieve significantly better outcomes in adulthood. Higher SAT scores, better stress tolerance, improved health markers, but what matters here is why they could wait. It wasn't discipline alone, it was cognitive reappraisal. They reframed the marshmallow, they distracted themselves, they trained their focus away from the urge and toward the bigger outcome. That's mindset. In adulthood, this same skill shows up when you sit through a difficult study session instead of scrolling, when you rewrite a proposal instead of submitting your first draft, when you rest strategically instead of quitting out of exhaustion. You're building a system of self-regulation, and that system is stronger than any amount of natural intelligence or ability, because talent gives you an edge at the start, but mindset gives you compound returns. The compounding effect is massive. Think about someone who improves 1% per week through intentional practice, feedback loops, and reflection. Over a year, they're not just marginally better, they're exponentially more capable. Neural networks have reorganized, emotional responses have matured, identity has shifted. Meanwhile, the person with talent who didn't engage in that process may still be coasting on what they knew last year, declining because they stopped growing, and this decline can be brutal, especially in fast-moving fields. You can't coast on fixed knowledge, you can't automate old skills forever, your edge dulls unless you're sharpening it constantly. That's why mindset is not just preferable, it's essential. In a world defined by rapid change, let's now examine the concept of friction, the resistance that arises when effort meets complexity. People who are mindset-oriented interpret friction as part of the process. They don't expect flow to feel like ease. They know that real flow often starts with friction, that effort must be front-loaded. This changes their relationship to discipline. They stop looking for perfect conditions. They start moving regardless. Compare that to someone who only performs when everything's aligned, when they're motivated, well, rested, praised. That person's performance is conditional. Mindset removes the conditions. It says, show up anyway, and that repetition, the act of showing up despite, creates a deeper kind of self-trust. You learn that you can execute without drama, without external approval, without guarantees. This changes your internal locus of control, the belief that your results are shaped by your actions. The stronger your locus of control, the more empowered your brain becomes under challenge. That's not wishful thinking, it's literally reinforced by dopaminergic circuits. A person with mindset sees themselves as a participant in their evolution, not a passive observer of it. That belief fuels persistence, and persistence changes the architecture of the brain. Long-term goal pursuit strengthens the cingulate cortex, which regulates error detection and sustained attention. It increases white matter density between brain regions responsible for planning and emotion regulation. It enhances functional connectivity, meaning your thoughts, emotions, and actions become more integrated over time. Talent doesn't train any of this. It doesn't demand it. Mindset demands it. Because mindset lives in trenches. Now let's pull this into the domain of creativity. Many believe that creativity is a gift, something mystical or innate. But when you look at prolific creators, writers, artists, entrepreneurs, what you find is not inspiration, it's iteration. They produce a lot of work, most of it average, some of it bad, and occasionally something brilliant. What makes them different is their willingness to create under imperfect conditions, to push through the mundane, the stuck, the uninspired. That's mindset. Talent might give you taste, but mindset gives you output, and output gives you options. This is also why the rate of experimentation matters more than initial ability. The person willing to run 100 experiments will outpace the person running 10 perfect ones. The iterative process forces adaptation, learning, and eventually innovation. Talent resists this. It wants to be right the first time. Mindset doesn't care. Mindset says, I'll keep going until it works. And the same principle applies in relationships, leadership, even parenting. The most effective communicators are not necessarily the most articulate. They are the most attuned. They adapt. They listen. They evolve their methods based on feedback. That's emotional intelligence, another skill rooted in a growth-oriented mindset, not raw ability. Even recovery and resilience follow this principle. Talent often collapses under pressure because it hasn't been stressed gradually. But mindset includes the training of recovery. People who bounce back fast aren't lucky. They've learned how to modulate their nervous system through breath, movement, reflection, and sometimes simply patience. They don't confuse rest with weakness. They use it as fuel for the next cycle, and this completes the loop. Mindset doesn't just outperform talent, it integrates everything talent can't access. It builds grit, agility, endurance, creativity, emotional range, and most of all, momentum. That's the true engine of growth. So when we talk about why mindset beats talent every time, we're not speaking in motivational cliches, we're speaking in neurobiology, in behavioral science, in long-term reality. Talent is a spark, it's a signal, but mindset is the system, the engine that turns challenge into growth, repetition into skill, and failure into fuel. If you want to build something lasting, Skill, a career, a life of meaning. Don't ask, what am I good at? Ask instead, what am I willing to get better at every single day? Because the science is clear, your brain is not fixed, your outcomes are not predetermined, and your limits are not defined by where you start, they're defined by how far you're willing to go. That's not optimism, that's reality, and mindset is how you take full control of it.